My name is Anna, and I'm 29 years old. I've always been someone who takes on responsibility, even from a young age. But I never imagined that my life would change so drastically after my father passed away. The day he died, I was 24, freshly graduated from college, and just starting to figure out what kind of life I wanted to lead. Little did I know, I was about to be thrust into a position where I had to become the sole provider for my family. When my dad died, it wasn't just the loss of a parent, it was the loss of the person who had been the financial backbone of our household. My mother, who had never worked outside the home, had no skills or experience to offer the workforce, and my younger sister, Kiki, was still in her early 20s, trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. I was suddenly faced with the reality that I was the only one capable of supporting us financially. At first, I was determined to keep going. I found a stable job right after graduation, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was enough to cover the bills. My mom was grieving, and I understood that, but it didn't make the weight of everything any easier to carry. As time went on, I took on extra shifts and even a part-time job to help cover the increasing costs. I worked tirelessly, day in and day out, just to keep our heads above water. But the longer I kept this up, the more I began to feel the exhaustion and frustration building within me. Kiki, my younger sister, was no help. I don't mean to sound harsh, but she simply wasn't pulling her weight. She had found her passion. Being a spiritual healer, she did some work as a life coach, but it didn't pay the bills. Her clients were few, and the ones she had didn't pay enough to support anyone, let alone a family in crisis. While I was slaving away to make ends meet, Kiki was living in her own little world. She'd spend hours meditating or guiding others through spiritual sessions. But I knew that her so-called calling wasn't going to bring in any income. I tried to have a conversation with her about it, telling her that maybe it was time to think about getting a part-time job or doing something more financially stable. I even suggested she start contributing a portion of her earnings to help with our living expenses, but she dismissed all of my concerns, claiming that her work was more important than anything else. "I'm helping people find peace," she'd say, as though that somehow justified her inability to support herself or help out at home. I wasn't asking her to drop her passion, but I needed her to understand that we were in a crisis. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, and no one else was offering any help. Every time I turned around, Kiki was demanding more money for her organic groceries or her weekly spa treatments. She'd even ask for money for beauty treatments, like manicures and haircuts, which I found absurd. I'm all for self-care, but it wasn't realistic when we couldn't even make rent without me working 3 jobs. The worst part of it all was how entitled Kiki became. If I refused to give her the money she asked for, she'd go to Mom and complain. And sure enough, Mom would come to me asking for more money, as though I was supposed to support Kiki's every whim. I loved my mom, but she wasn't helping. Instead of encouraging Kiki to get a job, she enabled her, constantly giving her the excuse that she's just trying to find herself. The stress from my job, the financial strain, and the emotional toll of constantly trying to make my family see reason began to take its toll on me. I found myself at a breaking point, but I had nowhere to turn. I was doing everything I could to keep things together, but the more I gave, the more they took. I had no choice but to continue, even though I was burning out. The idea that I was the only one who could hold this family together was both a responsibility I couldn't escape from and a burden I didn't know how much longer I could carry. Things didn't improve. As much as I wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch, reality hit hard every single day. My job was draining, but it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on me. It was the emotional toll of knowing that my own family wasn't stepping up. Kiki, my younger sister, was supposed to be my partner in this, but she never really saw things the way I did. In her world, everything was about finding peace, balance, and spiritual fulfillment. I didn't blame her for wanting those things. I understood her desire to follow her path, but at the same time, I couldn't wrap my head around how she could be so oblivious to our situation. Every day felt like a battle. I'd get home from work, completely exhausted, and there Kiki would be, lounging on the couch, reading books about energy healing or some other spiritual practice. Her clients would trickle in and out, paying her pocket change for what she called life-changing advice. Meanwhile, I was out there working overtime to keep the lights on, to make sure we had enough food, and to keep a roof over our heads. I tried to talk to her about it. I told her that While I understood her passion, it wasn't paying the bills. I suggested she get a part-time job to help out, even if it was something temporary until she could build her practice into something more stable. But she brushed me off every time. "My work is important, Anna," she'd say, as though that alone justified her lack of financial contribution. "I'm healing people's souls." It frustrated me beyond measure. How could she be so blind to the reality of our situation? I was the one sacrificing my time, energy, and sanity to hold this family together. I was the one who had to take care of everything while Kiki lived in her own little world, content to offer her services to whoever would listen, no matter how little it paid. And then there was Mom. Mom was caught in the middle of it all. She saw both sides, and while she understood that I was doing my best, she still couldn't bring herself to push Kiki to do more. She'd tell me that Kiki needed support, that she was just figuring things out. I understood that. I really did. But that didn't mean I should bear the weight of the world on my shoulders while Kiki got to ignore reality. Kiki's demands for money only increased as time went on. I'd come home after working 3 jobs and find her waiting for me, asking for money to buy organic groceries or pay for a beauty treatment. I'd tell her I didn't have the funds, that I couldn't afford it, and she'd act as though I was the unreasonable one. If I didn't give her what she wanted, she'd go straight to Mom, who would then pressure me to help her out. This cycle kept repeating. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. Kiki never seemed to realize the sacrifices I was making for our family. She took it for granted, like it was my duty to give up my life for hers. And Mom, she just stood by, not really helping, but certainly not stopping Kiki from draining me either. The situation only got worse when Kiki started dating someone who was completely unreliable. This guy, from what I could tell, had no interest in being committed to her, and he made no effort to improve his situation. He'd string her along, making promises he never kept, and often hanging out with other women behind her back. It was a mess, and Kiki, always the emotional one, became obsessed with him. She kept chasing after someone who clearly wasn't right for her, all while using the chaos in her relationship as an excuse to avoid dealing with the real problems in her life. One night, Kiki confronted him after catching him with another woman. It escalated quickly. Kiki was heartbroken, and when she confronted him, things got physical. She punched him in the face, threw his stuff around, and threatened to hurt him further. The neighbors called the police, and when they arrived, they found Kiki at the center of the violence. She was arrested, but luckily for her, her boyfriend chose not to press charges. And since it was her first offense, she was let go with a warning. I thought maybe this would be a wake-up call for her. Maybe the drama would force her to see that she needed to change. But no, Kiki refused to acknowledge the seriousness of what had happened. She saw her actions as justified. "I had every right to do that," she told me, unapologetic. "He deserved it." I couldn't believe it. Instead of learning from the experience, Kiki became even more reckless. She sulked around the house, using her breakup as an excuse to avoid all responsibility. She spent her days out with friends, getting drunk and bringing strangers home. It was like nothing mattered to her. She didn't care about the havoc she was wreaking in our lives. I tried talking to her, but she wouldn't listen. She dismissed my concerns as overreacting and carried on with her reckless behavior. I was at my wit's end. How could I help someone who didn't want to be helped? How could I continue shouldering the burden of everything when no one else in the house seemed willing to change? I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Then came the day that changed everything. Mom pulled me aside, and for the first time, she admitted that she was worried about Kiki. She had discovered that Kiki had started using drugs. That was the last straw for me. Kiki had crossed a line, and I didn't know how much more I could take. Mom suggested sending her to a wellness retreat, one that was meant to help with emotional healing. But I couldn't understand how we could afford such a luxury. We could barely make ends meet as it was. When I questioned the cost, Mom casually reminded me that I had been saving for a car and suggested I use that money to send Kiki and her to the retreat. I was floored. My car, the one thing I had been saving for, the one thing I needed for my own sanity and efficiency, was suddenly up for grabs. My savings, which had been carefully set aside for months, were now being treated as a solution to Kiki's problems. I explained to Mom that I needed that money for my car. I needed it for my future, for my well-being. But Mom insisted that Kiki's needs were more important. The argument escalated quickly, and that was when I knew something had to change. The night it all fell apart, I returned home after another grueling shift, my body aching from exhaustion, my mind foggy from a lack of sleep. I thought I'd at least have a few quiet moments to myself, but instead, I was greeted by an eerie silence. Normally, I'd hear Mom watching TV or Kiki tinkering around the house, but tonight, everything was still. I called out for both of them, hoping they'd pop up from somewhere, maybe the kitchen or the living room, but there was nothing. I stepped into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it, a note on the fridge. My heart dropped as I pulled it off, the familiar handwriting of my mom staring back at me. "Sorry we couldn't wait for you. Kiki and I are on our way to the luxury retreat. I know you'll be upset, but honestly, money can always be earned back. But your sister's mental health comes first. We'll see you in a week." I stood there, staring at the note, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. It was like my entire world had just tilted. For months, I'd been working myself to the bone, saving every penny for a car I desperately needed. The thought of cutting down my commute was one of the few things that kept me going. But now my mother, my own mother, had stolen the savings I'd worked so hard to accumulate. I couldn't believe it. I felt sick. I immediately ran to my computer, logging into my bank account with trembling hands. There it was. Every last cent I had carefully set aside was gone. My savings had vanished, all used to fund their luxury retreat. I couldn't breathe. How could they do this to me? After everything I'd sacrificed, after everything I'd done for them, they took it all without so much as a conversation. I sank to the floor, staring at the screen in disbelief. Tears started streaming down my face. The weight of it all, the exhaustion, the betrayal, the endless sacrifices, hit me all at once. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or the lack of it. I'd been the one holding everything together while they lived their lives. Unchecked and unbothered by the strain they put on me, I tried calling Mom immediately, hoping she'd explain herself, hoping she'd somehow make this make sense. But she didn't pick up. Instead, I was left with voicemail after voicemail, each one more infuriating than the last. Kiki's response was even worse. She didn't even offer an apology. She just sent me a smug, condescending wink emoji. A wink? That was it. No remorse. No acknowledgement of the hurt she had caused. Just a tiny digital smile, as if it was all just some game to her. I had been taken for granted for so long, but this was the final straw. I couldn't keep going on like this. I had been so focused on making sure they were okay that I had ignored my own needs, my own life. My mother and Kiki had taken everything from me, and there was no way I could keep pretending that it was all okay. I had given so much, and for what? To have it all thrown back in my face? The next day, I made a decision. I was done. I had to leave. I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep pretending like I was okay with being the one to sacrifice everything while they continued to live irresponsibly. It wasn't just about the money. It was about my dignity, my peace of mind, and my future. I spent the rest of the day packing up my things. Every item I took with me was a reminder of everything I had built for them, only to have it taken away in an instant. I grabbed my clothes, my personal belongings, and the things I had bought to make our house feel like a home. Kitchen appliances, furniture, all the little things I had worked so hard for. I knew I couldn't leave them behind. These things weren't just items. They were proof of my commitment to keeping this family afloat. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to explain myself. They knew what they had done. They knew how much I had sacrificed for them, and they still chose to take from me without a second thought. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of an explanation. I was done trying to make them understand. I called a close friend, someone who had always supported me through thick and thin. She graciously offered to let me stay with her while I figured out my next steps. I didn't know what I would do next, but at least I would have a roof over my head for a while. The hardest part was walking out the door without looking back. As I closed it behind me, I felt a mixture of guilt and relief. I knew I had to do this for myself, but part of me still felt like I was abandoning them. They would be fine, I told myself. They always had been. They just didn't realize how much they had taken from me, how much they had relied on me without ever stepping up in return. When Mom and Kiki returned home, they were frantic. They called me repeatedly, leaving desperate messages. "Where are you? What happened? Why did you take all your things? Mom's voice was filled with confusion and frustration. She didn't understand why I had left. She didn't understand why I was angry. She just wanted to know why I couldn't fix things again. Like I always had. I didn't respond at first. I let them stew in their confusion. Let them feel what it was like to be left without someone to rely on. For once, I wasn't the one picking up the pieces. Eventually, I did call Mom back. She answered immediately, and I could tell from her voice that she had been crying. Kiki was there too, and I could hear the frustration in her voice as she demanded to know why I had left. Mom tried to justify everything, explaining how Kiki's mental health needed to be addressed and that the retreat was necessary. She told me I shouldn't still be upset, but I wasn't having it anymore. I calmly told Mom that I had moved out for good. I wasn't coming back. I reminded her that they had gone behind my back, stolen my savings, and spent it on something I had never agreed to. I told her I couldn't keep supporting them when they didn't respect me or my boundaries. Mom pleaded with me. She begged me to come back, to fix everything, but I wasn't going back. I was done. Kiki's yelling in the background didn't even faze me anymore. I had spent too many years sacrificing my own happiness for them, and it was time to put myself first for once. I ended the call, blocked their numbers, and cut off all contact. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The weight had been lifted. I was no longer responsible for their actions or their failures. It's been a few days since I made the decision to leave, and the reality of it is still sinking in. I didn't expect it to be easy, but I also didn't expect the level of resistance I've been getting. Since I left, things between me and Mom have only escalated. I thought, in my mind, that by stepping away, I would be taking control of my life again. But the emotional manipulation, the guilt trips, the endless barrage of phone calls, it's been overwhelming. I stayed with my friend for a few days while I figured things out. I didn't know where I would go next or what I would do, but for once, I wasn't thinking about what was best for them. I was thinking about what was best for me. The constant stress of trying to keep everyone together, trying to save them from themselves, had been eating away at me for so long, and now I was free from that, or at least I thought I was. Mom didn't let up. She kept calling, texting, and even reaching out through mutual friends. She told them to tell me that I had to come home, that I couldn't leave them like this. She said I was being selfish. All the while, Kiki just stayed quiet. She didn't even bother reaching out to me directly. I guess, after everything, I wasn't surprised by her silence. I'd always been the one to pick up the pieces, the one to keep everything together. And now that I was gone, she was still too wrapped up in her own problems to care about what I was going through. A few days later, Mom showed up at my friend's place. She came by unannounced, knocking on the door like nothing had happened. When I opened it, there she stood, looking exhausted, her eyes red from crying. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her, not after everything that had happened. She had betrayed me in a way that I could never forgive. She started pleading with me, telling me that she couldn't do it without me. She said Kiki was spiraling, and she couldn't manage everything on her own. She even begged me to come back and help. She said things like, "Your father would want us to be a family again." It was the same old emotional manipulation, the same guilt trips she had always used to control me. She knew I cared about our family. She knew how much I loved her and Kiki, and she used that against me. But I wasn't the same person I used to be. I wasn't the girl who would just bend over backwards to make everyone happy, even at the cost of my own happiness. I wasn't the girl who would keep sacrificing herself just to keep the peace. I had been doing that for years, and look where it had gotten me: exhausted, bitter, and unappreciated. When she asked me to come back, I told her no. I told her I couldn't do it anymore. I wasn't going to keep enabling Kiki's behavior, and I wasn't going to keep carrying the weight of their mistakes on my shoulders. I was tired of being the responsible one, the one who always had to fix things. I told her that Kiki was an adult, and it was time for her to take responsibility for her own life. Mom didn't take it well. She started crying again, trying to convince me that I was making a huge mistake, but I stood my ground. I told her that I needed to do this for myself, that I needed to live my life without constantly having to worry about them. And then, Kiki finally spoke up. She came to the door, standing behind Mom, her arms crossed over her chest like she was waiting for me to apologize. But I didn't apologize. I wasn't the one who needed to apologize. I had given them everything, and they had taken it without ever looking back. I told Kiki that I wasn't going to keep enabling her anymore. I told her that if she wanted to live her life recklessly, that was her choice. But it wasn't my responsibility to bail her out. She was an adult now, and she needed to figure things out on her own. That didn't sit well with her. She started yelling, calling me selfish, accusing me of abandoning them when they needed me the most. Mom joined in, telling me that I couldn't just walk away from my family, that I owed them. But all I could think about was how they had taken everything from me, how they had drained me emotionally, financially, and mentally. I was done. I wasn't going to keep paying the price for their inability to take responsibility for their own lives. I ended the conversation there. I told them both that I was moving on with my life and that I wasn't coming back. I didn't owe them anything. And with that, I shut the door, leaving them standing on the other side. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything I had been through, everything I had given up. It felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but there was still a part of me that felt guilty. I had always been the one to keep the family together, to make sure everyone was okay. Walking away from them felt like a betrayal, even though I knew it wasn't. It was just the reality of the situation. I had given them everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. It wasn't just about money or the car anymore. It was about my life, my future. I had spent so many years putting everyone else first that I had lost sight of what mattered to me. But now, I was taking control of my own life, and no amount of guilt or manipulation was going to change that. The next day, I made a decision to take the next step. I was going to start over. I began looking for apartments, finally planning to make a home for myself. It felt like the first real step toward independence that I had taken in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, but that wasn't the end. It wasn't long before Mom and Kiki tried to contact me again, but this time, I wasn't backing down. A few days passed, and things started to settle. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of responsibility crushing me. I was still staying at my friend's place, figuring out my next steps, but I had a sense of relief. I was no longer running on empty, no longer constantly worrying about what my mom and Kiki would need next. It felt like I had finally taken control of my life. Then came the call. It was from Mom. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell something was off. She apologized, in a way, but I could hear the desperation in her tone. She told me how bad things had gotten for Kiki. She had been struggling, and without me, Mom was finding it hard to keep up. Her words were soaked in guilt and self-pity, and it almost felt like a repeat of every other conversation we'd had before. But this time, I didn't let it affect me. I stayed calm, reminding myself that I was no longer the person who would sacrifice everything for them. I was living for myself now. I wasn't going to keep going down the same path of constant sacrifice, only to be drained dry and left with nothing. I could hear Kiki in the background. She wasn't crying or asking for forgiveness. Instead, she was complaining about how hard things were, how life wasn't fair. She expected me to feel guilty for walking away, and honestly, part of me did. I loved them both, despite everything that had happened. But guilt wasn't going to make me compromise my own happiness and stability. I was done being their emotional punching bag. Still, I couldn't completely shut off the part of me that cared about them. When my mom asked me to come over and talk in person, I hesitated for a moment. She said it was urgent, that Kiki had been through something serious, and they needed me. I agreed to meet them, but only on the condition that it would be a calm conversation. I wasn't going to get dragged back into the chaos of their emotional manipulations. When I arrived at the house, I was greeted by the usual tension, but this time it felt different. Kiki was sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, looking disinterested in everything around her. Mom was pacing around the room, talking about how Kiki was going through something and how she needed help, how it was my responsibility to help her. I couldn't believe it. After everything, she still couldn't see the damage she had done. I took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be like the other conversations. I wasn't going to apologize or make excuses. I wasn't going to be the one to fix everything. I finally told them both what I had been holding inside for so long. "I'm done," I said, my voice firm but not angry. "I can't keep doing this for you. I can't keep sacrificing my life for you both when you don't even try to help yourselves." Kiki rolled her eyes, clearly not taking me seriously. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. We just need you to be there for us. You can't just walk away like this. I felt my blood boil, but I remained calm. I've been there for you, Kiki. I've given everything for both of you, but I can't keep giving when you don't appreciate it. I'm not your safety net anymore. Mom stepped in, looking almost desperate. You're being so selfish, Anna. You can't just leave us like this. Kiki needs help, and I can't do it alone. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't moved by her tears or her pleading. I had spent years trying to make everyone happy, trying to keep things together. And where did it get me? Exhausted, emotionally drained, and still unappreciated. You don't get it, Mom, I said, shaking my head. You're always asking me to fix things, but you don't ever see how much it costs me. I can't do it anymore. I have to live my own life. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Kiki was glaring at me now, and Mom was still crying, her hands pressed to her face. But I wasn't moved. I had done what I could, and it wasn't enough. No amount of guilt or manipulation was going to change that. I'm leaving, I said, turning to walk out the door. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Relief, guilt, sadness. I knew this was the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. I had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, trying to keep everyone happy. But at what cost? My own happiness, my own mental health, my own future. It wasn't worth it anymore. For the first time in years, I felt free, but I knew there was still a long road ahead. I had to rebuild my life, create a new future, and learn how to take care of myself before anyone else. The next few weeks were difficult. I focused on my work, on the little things that made me happy, and on finding a place to call my own. But every time I thought about the situation with Mom and Kiki, I couldn't help but wonder if I was making a mistake. Should I have stayed? Should I have given in? But deep down, I knew the answer. I was finally standing up for myself. I was finally learning to put myself first. It's been a few months since I left my Mom and Kiki behind, and while things haven't been easy, they've definitely been better. I moved into a small apartment that I now call my own. It's not much, but it's mine. I'm not drowning in debt, constantly stressed about what's going to happen next. I'm not spending every waking moment working 3 jobs just to keep everyone else afloat. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living for myself, and that alone has been worth everything. At first, the silence from my family was unbearable. I didn't expect them to understand, but I did hope they might come to terms with it and maybe even apologize. But no, the calls stopped, the messages stopped, and the guilt trips only lasted a few days before they realized they weren't getting anywhere. I knew they weren't just going to sit back and leave me alone forever, but I needed the space. I needed time to heal and figure out what I wanted out of life, something I hadn't done for so long. Then, just as I was starting to settle into my new routine, my phone rang late one evening. It was my mom. Her voice was different this time, softer, almost resigned. She wasn't begging like before, but there was still that underlying sense of guilt. I just wanted to check in, she said, her voice quieter than usual. How are you? How's everything? I had to take a moment before I responded. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened in the past few months. I didn't want to rehash old wounds, but at the same time, I couldn't pretend like everything was fine. I'm doing okay, Mom. Things are better, actually. I've been able to focus on myself for once. There was a pause. I know you're angry with me. I understand why you feel that way, she said, her voice faltering. I don't know what happened to us. I guess I was just scared. I didn't want to lose you. And Kiki, she's not doing well. She's been struggling. I listened quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but my mind was racing. I could feel the old feelings bubbling up, the ones that had kept me in that toxic cycle for so long. But this time, I held my ground. I get that you're scared, but I can't keep being the person you turn to when everything falls apart. You've got to take responsibility for your own life, Mom. And Kiki, too. I can't be the one holding everything together anymore. She was silent for a long time before replying. I'm sorry, Anna, I really am. I just didn't know what else to do. I was waiting for the part where she would say she needed something else from me, but it never came. Instead, she said something I didn't expect. I want you to be happy. I'm going to try harder, I promise. I hope you'll be okay. I felt a lump in my throat, but I didn't let myself cry. I just said, I will be, Mom. I have to be, and you will too. We didn't talk much longer. I ended the conversation feeling oddly peaceful, even though I knew nothing would change overnight. But it was a start. A few days later, Kiki texted me. She didn't ask for money. She didn't make any demands. She just asked if I was okay. And that was it. I didn't reply immediately. But I couldn't deny that it felt like a shift, a small but significant one. Maybe she was starting to understand, or maybe it was just her way of testing the waters. Either way, I didn't feel the need to rush back into the chaos. I didn't have to fix everything. I didn't have to carry the weight of their mistakes anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living my own life. I was no longer defined by my role as the family's caretaker. I was Anna, just Anna. The road ahead is still long. There are days when I wonder if I've made the right choice. There are days when I miss the family I used to have, but I know I can't go back to that. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm stronger, more self-aware, and more committed to my own happiness. And I will never let anyone, family or not, take that away from me again.